In this video, I'm going to show the process for upgrading a Laravel application. To do this, I'm going to be using a service called Laravel Shift, which is going to automate a lot of the upgrade process. But as you'll see, even with an automated service like Shift, there's still a lot of manual work that needs to happen when doing an upgrade, and I'm going to cover all of those details. Now, in this video, I am going to be going from Laravel version 8 to version 9, so there's going to be some things specific to that, but my hope is that the information I'm providing here should be applicable to other version changes you might be doing as well, because we're going to be looking not necessarily of the specifics of what changed in these versions, but just in general what the upgrade process looks like. And what you'll see is along the way, there will be bumps in the road. There will be issues in getting your application to work in the version you're switching to. But as part of this video, I'm going to go through those bumps. I'm going to show, what the problems are and how I'm going about troubleshooting them to just give you some insight into how you might approach similar problems when you're going through your upgrade process. So knowing all of that, let's jump right in. The site that I'm going to be upgrading is just the site for these videos, codewithsusan.com. And the first thing I like to do before doing any upgrades is run my tests just to make sure that they are passing. There's no issues in the application currently before I start making changes to it for the upgrade. So switching over to my code editor, I've got the application open. My terminal window is currently within the application, and the test suite that I'm using within this application is Laravel's Dusk. So I'm just going to go ahead and trigger that. And while this is running, I'll mention that, of course, not everybody will have testing implemented in their application. So this might not be an option for everyone, but I think this is actually a really good testament to why testing is important. When you're doing these sorts of shifts in your application, it can be really useful to have those tests in place so that after you do the upgrades, you can have that confidence that everything is working as expected. Now it looks like all my tests have passed, so that looks good. And hopefully by the end of this process, after I do the upgrade, I should be able to run these tests again and see the same passing scenario. All right, now with that set up, let's go back to Laravel Shift. And just a quick summary, Shift is a web service that the way it works is you will give it access to your GitHub repository where the project is that you want to update, and it'll actually go through your code base, make any of the changes necessary for the shift that you're making. In my case, that's from version 8 to 9. And then it'll send me a pull request with all those changes that I can review. It'll also include comments about things that it wasn't able to automatically change, that I might have to go in and manually make changes. Basically, it'll give you all the details you need. You can go through, pull in that pull request, make any manual changes necessary. And then, of course, at the very end, you want to test that everything is still working as expected. So that's the process in a nutshell. Let's see it in action. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. I'm going to choose to run a new shift. And then I'm going to narrow it down to the options for just Laravel applications. The version I'm running is 8. And then what I want to upgrade to is Laravel 9. So this is the package I want. You can see it's going to cost $19 to do this. We could follow the link to learn more to have a better understanding of what it's going to actually do. So you can see the core upgrades it's going to make, as well as any additional upgrades. And there is a note about manual upgrades. So it's not going to be able to automate everything. There's some things that you will have to manually go in and change within your application. But as you'll see in a moment when we run this, it'll give you a pretty detailed list of what those things are to guide you through that process. All right, so after scanning through there, let's go ahead and purchase this. And that'll take you to the next step, which is specifying what repository you want to do the upgrade on. In my case, because I've used Laravel Shift in the past, it is already aware of my GitHub account. If you're doing this for the first time, you might have to go through a process of connecting with your GitHub account. So just follow whatever instructions it gives you for that. And then for the repository or clone URL, what it's looking for here, let me go ahead and pull up the repository I'm going to be working with on GitHub. So this is going to be codewithsusan.com. It's either looking for your clone URL, which you can find under the green code button. You could just copy the SSH address, that would work. Or you just need your GitHub username followed by the name of the repository, which is also indicated in the URL for the repository. So I'll grab that, paste that in, and then the branch I'm going to be working on here is the main branch. Moving on in the next step, it'll ask for your credit card information. So you can go ahead and fill that out and then click Purchase Shift. And then we can see that the process is running for this upgrade, so I'll let it do its thing. And now that it's complete, we can click on the link under status. And here we can see the pull request that Laravel Shift initiated against our repository with all the details of the upgrade. And what we're going to want to do next is we're going to want to pull down the branch that Shift created with all of these changes so we can review everything. Specifically, if you look through the conversations here, you'll see a bunch of comments down below that Shift left addressing certain details that we might need to tend to manually. There are certain things that the automated process can't do, and so for each of those things, we have some detailed instructions down here of what we need to review or what we need to complete. So knowing that, let's pull this branch down. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy the name of the branch, go over to my code editor where I'm working locally on this project, and I'm first going to just do a git pull, pull down the latest changes, and then with that I should be able to switch over to the Shift branch. So we'll do git checkout, and I'll paste in the name of the branch. All right, so now my code base should be in a state of basically reflecting all the changes that Shift made. And just as evidence of that, I currently have my composer.json file open. And if we take a look at the framework version, you can see it did bump that up to 9.22. All right, so with those changes in place, let's go back to GitHub and go through these comments and understand what additional steps we might need to take. So for example, here it says Laravel 9 moved the resources lang folder to the top level of the project. While Shift moved and replaced references to this folder, you may have additional references to this folder that needs to be updated. All right, so resources lang, it looks like it was given a new location. And so if we look in resources, we no longer see a lang directory there, but now lang is just in the root of our application. So to address what it's talking about here in terms of any references we might have to this, something I would do for a note like this is just search for references to resources in lang within my code base and see if I'm actually referencing it, if there's anything I need to change. So let me pull up my search feature in my code editor, and I'm just going to search in this project for resources lang, and I'm not seeing any references here, and this checks out. I don't think I'm doing anything with language specific files in this project. All right, so we can mentally put a check mark there and move on to the next comment and basically repeat that process. So we'll review the comment, see what it's talking about. So here it's talking about some changes to the storage facade. Here are the details of the changes. I'm just going to do a quick search in my code base for the storage facade, see if I'm using it anywhere. So I'm going to search for storage, and just to narrow it down, because there's going to be a bunch of references to storage, but here they're specifically talking about the facade. So with the facades, we're typically accessing them with a double colon operator. So that narrows it down. And it looks like there are a couple instances in my code base where I am using the storage facade. Here specifically, I'm using storage get. And I think that's actually one of the methods it talks about in this comment. So it said read operations such as get and download now return null instead of a file not found exception when a file is missing. So this is actually relevant to my code because it looks like I do have a try catch here where I am expecting a file not found exception if it can't find it. So I need to rewrite this to accommodate that. So here's what I'm going to do. Because we're not dealing with exceptions anymore, I'm just going to go ahead and do a retrieval of the content, and then I'm going to say if is null raw content, then I will handle it as I was handling it previously, which is to set this data property has errors to be true and then just return from this function. Now, of course, with a code change like that, I shouldn't just assume that it's going to work. I want to test and make sure I haven't broken anything. And in general, speaking of that, now would probably be a good time to just run my tests and see where my application is at, both in regards to changes like this and also just all the other changes that Laravel Shift made. Before I run my test, though, rewinding a bit back to the comments that Laravel Shift left with us, it did note that we need to run Composer Update. And that makes sense because as part of the update process, Laravel Shift would have made some changes to our Composer dependencies. And so we just want to make sure our vendor directory is up to date with that. The other thing we'll want to do is clear any caches related to configs, routes, and views. So let's make sure we take care of those two steps before we run our tests. So coming back to my project, let me bring back my terminal. We'll do a Composer update. And that did fail. So let's take a look at this. This is a a good thing to see, because oftentimes after an update, you will get these sort of failures when trying to update your dependencies, because there might be discrepancies and conflicts, and it looks like we do have one here. So what it's saying is the Laravel framework is trying to require this package called Common Mark at version 2.2. And then we see a message about you can only install one version of a package. And I've seen this message before when basically I have two dependencies that are trying to include some shared subdependency, and they're requesting a different version. And I think that's what's going on here. I think Laravel wants Common Mark at 2.2, and then looking down further in the message, I have this other dependency, Markdown. It's looking for Common Mark 1.5, and Composer is saying we can't have two versions of that same dependency. So in a situation like this, what I want to do, I want to actually look at this Markdown package and see if it has any updates. It's possible that in their updates, they have actually updated their dependency for Common Mark to be consistent with the latest version, which I'm assuming is 2.2 if that's what Laravel is requesting. So let me pull this package up in GitHub, and we could take a closer look at if there's an update for that. All right, so it looks like the current version of this package is at version 14. And going back to my error output, I think I was still running version 13. So I'm going to go ahead and update that and see if that addresses the issue. So let me go to my composer.json file. And here's the package, this Markdown package. I'm going to update this to version 14.0. And let's do a composer update again. And perfect. It looks like we've got everything installed there. We didn't run into any problems. But that was a good example of something you will commonly face when upgrading Laravel, especially if you're using a lot of outside dependencies. Sometimes those dependencies might not be compatible with the upgrade, in which case, hopefully the developers of those dependencies release their own upgrades to make them compatible, which it looks like this particular package did. But that's not always the case, and that might be a hiccup you run into when trying to do the upgrade. And actually, speaking to that, what I often like to do when Laravel comes out with a new upgrade is I don't try to upgrade all of my projects immediately. I'd like to give it a little bit of time to give the developers of these other packages I might be using a chance to bring their packages up to date just so things run smoothly when I upgrade. Another note about this update that I just made is just being aware that when you make updates like this, you're changing the underlying software that your application is interacting with, and there's always the potential for conflicts to arise there, right? This Markdown package might change, certain methods and how they work, and if I have code that's interacting with that, that could introduce some breaking changes into my features. So to address this, it's probably a good idea to go back to the package information and look through things like the commit history and just get a sense of what is actually involved with this update, so I can just be aware of any potential conflicts that could be introduced. And then, of course, if you've got tests in place, hopefully if there are any conflicts, your tests will alert you of that. So I'm just going to put a pin in this in my mind in terms of when I run my tests, thinking about what features within my test are relying on this dependency, and just making sure that I have good test coverage there to make sure everything's still working as expected. But moving on, we want to get to running our tests. We had to run Composer update and get that working. The other thing we had to do, if we go back to the Shift notes, is we want to clear our caches. So let's do that. So I'll run PHP artisan cache clear, and everything worked there. So let's try to run my Dusk tests. And it looks like those failed across the board. Scrolling through some of the error messages, I'm getting a port issue, connection refused. In the past, when I've gotten this, I've just needed to update my Chrome driver that Artisan is using. So let's run that command. I can't remember what it is, but Artisan will tell us. And we're going to go under the section for Dusk. And Chrome driver is what I'm going to run here. So PHP Artisan Chrome driver. All right, that's updated, and let's try to run those tests again. And slightly better results this time. I've got 5 errors out of my 12 tests and 15 assertions. So some of my tests are passing, just not all of them. So let's investigate why they're failing. To do this, I'm going to go over into my testing directory, And under browser, which is where all of our Dusk specific code is, I want to look at the screenshots directory because this is where Dusk is going to create snapshots anytime it comes across an error. So often we can find some useful clues here. And I'll just look at the last one. And let's zoom in on this. So it's telling us unexpected item common mark. So that sounds familiar because we were just talking about packages using common mark. So this could be related to that markdown package we just updated. And in fact, looking at the code itself, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit further. Yeah, so within my code, it looks like I've got this class load notes, and I'm invoking that markdown package. I'm invoking a method convert to HTML, and that is failing. So based on this information, I'm going to go take a closer look at that package and understand why this is failing. Did they change the name of the method or how the method's supposed to be used? Something's going wrong here. So let's go back to the GitHub repository for this package. I'm going to go back to the commit history. And skimming through here, the thing that stands out to me is this commit right here where it says update usage. So let's see what this commit entailed. All right, so here's in the README file, they changed the documentation saying that instead of using convert to HTML, it looks like we now need to say convert and then get content. So this actually looks exactly like what my problem is because in my code, I was doing convert to HTML. And then scrolling down, we could see they updated their test for this. Yeah, so every instance of that, they're updating to convert followed by get content. So let's make that change in our code and see if that fixes it. This is happening in, which file was this? This was in a class called load notes. So I'm going to pull that up. And I'm going to find references to markdown. We're going to change this to convert, get content. And then let's run our test again and see if that improves things. And it looks like we're still failing. Let's look at our screenshots again. The error this time is unexpected item common mark. And this is coming from when we're triggering that markdown convert. So I'm not really sure what I'm doing wrong here. So let's take this exception and let's search for it in the issues portion of this package and see if anybody else has encountered this same problem. So we're going to go over to issues and I'm going to search for unexpected item common mark. All right, we've got one post here referencing Laravel 9 support. So I'm just going to skim through these comments. And it looks like here's a reference to the exception we're seeing. So this person said that the version 14 branch worked fine on their application. They did need to republish the configuration files as I encountered the validation exception. Furthermore, convert to HTML has been deprecated in favor of convert. So we knew that, we already fixed that. So it seems like because we're getting the same exception, we just need to republish our configuration files. And this comment that follows that is confirming it. So the steps they took was they updated, which we've already done that. They removed their existing config for Markdown, and then they ran PHP Artisan Vendor Publish to regenerate it. So let's follow those steps on our end. Rather than removing the Markdown config, though, I'm going to make a backup copy of it because I think I have made customizations to that config, so I don't want to wipe it out when I regenerate it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'll just call this Markdown backup. And then I will delete the existing Markdown. And then I'll run the PHP Artisan Vendor Publish. And then I need to scroll through here and find the particular package we're working with, which is this one right here, the Markdown service provider. This is number 3. So I'm going to enter number 3. And that generated a new Markdown config file. And what I want to do is compare this against my backup, just so any customizations I made in my backup can be ported over. So I've already got my backup file open. Let's open up the new Markdown config file. And let me open these up side by side. So on the left will be the original. This is my backup file. And on the right is the new configuration file. And I'm just going to scroll through these, doing like a side by side comparison. All right, so the first setting is we're setting views to be true. So that looks like that's the same. Then we have an extensions array, which in my backup, it's empty. And in the new version, it's not empty. We have a bunch of extensions here referencing common mark. And I suspect this is probably where our error was coming from, because it was talking about some reference to common mark. So I bet we need these extensions listed here in this new version. So I'll leave that as is. And then the next settings, we have some renderer settings. So everything looks the same there. We get into some settings that are either enabled or disabled. And it looks like in the new version, they've actually moved them to this subarray under common mark. So here, enable M is just its own setting, where here it's nested in common mark. So I'm going to obviously keep the new format and just make sure the values are the same. So it's true here and it was true over here. So that looks good. Same thing for enable strong, asterisk, underscore, and HTML input is the next thing. I don't see that listed here. It looks like that's the next option. So we'll get to that in a moment. There's this reference to unordered list markers, which I didn't have previously. So that appears to be a new setting that's available. So I think everything looks good there. So let's look at HTML input. It looks like in the new version, the default they've set it to is strip, whereas in my version, I had it to an empty string. This option is specifying how to handle untrusted HTML input. And I think I remember making this setting change. I didn't want it to actually strip HTML characters from my markdown. So I undid the default. I got rid of strip. And I think I want to do the same thing here. So I'm going to make that config change here and make it consistent with what I had it previously. Next, it's about unsafe links, which it's true on both sides. So that looks good. Maximum nesting level. Looks like the new default is PHP int max, whereas before it was INF. Looks like I hadn't made a change here. I left it as the default, so I'm just going to do that in this new config as well. All right, then we got some settings for slug normalizer, which doesn't look like it was in the old markdown file, so this is all new. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave that as the defaults. All right, so I think that looks good. I think I'm pretty confident I've got all of my previous changes I had made to this config file ported over. Let's run our tests again, see where this gets us. And we're still failing, so going back to our screenshots, let's see what's going on now. All right, so we are getting a different error here. It says the item HTML input expects to be strip, allow, or escape. All right, so it looks like that setting it to a blank string like we were just looking at is not actually an option we can use here. So I'm going to change it to allow, because I think that's the equivalent of what I want, which is basically just to allow any HTML input. Don't do anything to it in terms of escaping characters or stripping characters. So let's go back to our markdown config, back to our HTML input settings, and I'm going to say allow and run my tests again. And perfect. It looks like all of our tests are now passing. So feeling pretty good about this upgrade at this point, but I always like to do a little bit of manual testing as well, just to double check and make sure all my bases are covered. So let me pull up this application in the browser. All right, so we can see the home page is working as expected. I'm going to click on one of the guides. That's loading. That looks good. I'm going to go to my account. No errors here. I'm going to test out the logout functionality. Logged out. Let's try logging back in. Log in via GitHub first. All right, that worked. Let's log out again, and this time we're going to log in with email and password. You can see it is auto-filling here just because I am working on the development version of this site, and I do have it set to pre-fill forms just so I can quickly test things. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. All right, that worked good. And you get the idea. You basically want to run through your application and just kind of poke at it, making sure that everything is still working as expected. And you want to be as comprehensive as possible, but as your applications grow in complexity, it's not always going to be possible to manually test everything or remember every feature that has to be tested. And that's why it's so important that you have automated testing like I was showing in place to make sure that you're really checking all your bases, especially when you do upgrades like this. There's just so much room and potential for things to go wrong. So having testing in place is definitely important. But I feel pretty confident that I could go to production with this. So the final steps I need to do is now get the changes that are in the Shift branch merged into my main branch and pushed to production. So what I'm going to do is come back to command line, and I first want to commit any of the changes I've made on this branch. So let's just do a git status. And we did modify the load notes class. That's where we had to update the method that the markdown dependency was using. We also updated our composer. This is where we updated the version of that markdown dependency. We bumped it up to 14. Of course, we did generate a new config file for that. And then we've got one untracked file. This is my backup markdown file, which I don't need that anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove that. All right, with that, I think all of these files are ready to be committed. So I'll do git add, and I'll add all of them. And before I actually commit this, it just occurred to me that going back to the pull request from Shift, remember earlier we were going through some of the comments of things that we needed to potentially manually address, and we addressed a couple of them, but I didn't get through the full list. So even though my application is tested and working, I should go through all of these notes and just make sure there's nothing else that impacts my application. So the last note we had looked at was about the mailer change. So the next one is referencing environment variables. It looks like there was a change in Laravel 9 for the file system driver environment variable is now called file system disk. And it's alerting us of this because environment variables are typically in files that are not tracked by Git. In other words, it's not part of this repository. And because of that, Shift can't actually make that change for us. So this is something we'll want to manually address. So what I'm going to do is open up my environment file and look for this particular variable. So let's go find my environment file. And I'm going to search for file system driver. And then it says we need to update it to file system disk. All right, so that should be good. And the next comment is talking about our configuration files. So this is going to be all of our configs within our config directory, all of these files. And the way that it handled it is it looks like it defaults them and then merges our customizations. So this is actually very similar to what we just manually did with the markdown configuration file, where we basically updated it to the latest version. So we knew that we had all of the latest configurations, and then we manually brought in any of the previous customizations we had made to that config. It seems like it's doing the same thing here with our other configuration files. It's just automating that process. So this is something that if I didn't have testing in place, I would want to take a closer look at this and just make sure that everything was done correctly. You could see, you could review the particular commit where these changes were made. But based on the fact that this is a pretty straightforward application and I am confident about my tests, I'm going to assume that if there were any problems introduced by these config changes, that my tests would have caught it. So I'm going to move past this, but definitely something, again, depending on your test coverage, you might want to spend more or less time looking carefully at notes like this. Moving on, the next comment is talking about another environment, file system cloud, saying that it was removed in as of Laravel 8. I don't think I'm doing anything with file system cloud, but I'm just going to search my environment file for this. Yeah, I don't see any reference to that, so I think we're good there. The next comment is talking about the token driver for API authentication. No longer available. I'm not doing anything with API authentication in this application, so that doesn't apply here. Shift updated your dependencies for Laravel 9. While many of the popular packages are reviewed, you may have to update additional packages in order for your application to be compatible with Laravel 9. And that's actually exactly what we had to do with that markdown package. So we've already taken care of that, and based on my tests and being able to run Composer Update without any problems, I'm going to assume all my other dependencies are also on track and working as expected. Laravel 9 adopted anonymous migrations. Shift automated this change to align with modern Laravel conventions and avoid naming migrations. There's nothing we need to actually do here. It's just making us aware of it. And if you follow the link, it'll tell you more information about this change. And then the final comment is just letting us know that Laravel 9 now uses Vite for front-end asset building instead of Laravel Mix. It says you can continue to use Mix. I think I am using Mix on this project. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to continue to use Mix and perhaps down the road upgrade to Vite, but not anything I need to address right now. And that was the final comment we needed to review. And hopefully that just gave you some insight into the kind of things to expect in these comments, the kind of things that you'll have to manually look at after Shift has done its work. Of course, the comments you see here are going to vary depending on your application and which versions you're shifting from, but this just gives you a general idea of what to expect here. All right, so with that reviewed, let's go back. Let's finish this commit. And for my commit message, I'll just say post, update, fixes, and checks. And then I will push those changes. And then I'm going to switch back to my main branch where I'm going to want to merge in this Shift branch. So I'm just going to copy the name of the branch and let's do git checkout. I'm going to go back to my main branch and I'll just do a quick status check here, making sure I don't have any changes. I don't, so let's go ahead and merge in our Shift branch. So we've got all of those changes merged in. We could just do a quick git status check. You can see there were 16 commits brought in by that merge. So the final thing we want to do is push to make sure that all of those commits are synced with our main branch on GitHub. And with those changes in sync, let's switch over now to the production server. We're going to pull down those latest changes. So I'm just going to open up my terminal window and just SSH into my production server. Move into the project I'm working on. Git pull to get the latest changes. And currently it's saying it's already up to date. And that's just because actually in between takes of this video, I had already done a git pull. So you don't get to see the full outcome here where it pulls in all of those changes from our Shift commit. But you can imagine what that looks like and just trust that at this point, my production code base is in sync with what is on GitHub, which is of course in sync with what I had locally. And now that I've got all the code in sync, I need to also make sure all of my dependencies are up to date here in production. So I will run composer install no dev. This is our typical composer update command that we run in a production context. It's going to make sure we get the exact same dependency versions that we were running locally, and it's going to exclude any development specific dependencies. And then finally, just like we did locally, we also want to clear our caches. So we'll run php artisan cache clear. And let's see if it's working. So going back to the browser, I'm going to switch over to the production version of this application. And it looks like that's loading, no problems on the initial page. And just like I did locally, I would now want to spend a little bit of time just, going through the different features and making sure everything's working as expected. But for this video, I'm going to wrap things up here. And I think to conclude, I just want to highlight two takeaways from this process. One is understanding that Laravel Shift does simplify the upgrade process quite a bit, but it's not a completely hands-off procedure. As you saw, there were several things that I had to do after doing the shift to get the application to actually work. And the second big takeaway, I think, is just the importance of having testing in place. It makes doing upgrades like this a lot less stressful because you're less afraid of breaking things, or more specifically, breaking things that you're not even aware of. So if you haven't started integrating testing as part of your development process, I highly, highly recommend it. It'll allow you to sleep easier at night.